Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The book I am interpreting for you today is a French classic literary masterpiece called The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. Whether or not you have been to Paris, besides the Eiffel Tower, one of the most well-known landmarks is the Notre-Dame Cathedral, largely thanks to the novel of the same name published by the great French writer Victor Hugo in 1831. Hugo can be considered a national writer in France. He was one of the few writers who received a state funeral after his death, with over 2 million people participating in his funeral procession, which almost turned into a national celebration. He was also a writer with a strong democratic spirit and actively participated in political movements in France throughout his life. Due to his opposition to the rule of Napoleon III, he went into exile from France for nearly 20 years. He was also a staunch advocate against the death penalty, demonstrating a modern consciousness in the 19th century. When we mention Hugo now, most people immediately think of his works The Hunchback of Notre-Dame and Les Miserables. Most readers outside of France got to know him through these two novels. However, in reality, Hugo had hardly written any highly influential novels before The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. Why is that? It's because he had been primarily focused on writing poetry and plays. From the late 18th century to the early 19th century, France was in a state of revolution. The French Revolution in 1789 overthrew the Bourbon dynasty, followed by several rounds of parliamentary sessions and the beheading of the king, with different factions taking power and sending each other to the guillotine. After experiencing the short reigns of Napoleon and Charles X, the July Revolution erupted in 1830. In such an environment, influenced by the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, the French literary world finally embraced the Romantic movement after England and Germany. It was a sweeping movement that encompassed all art forms, emphasizing individualism and passionate emotional expression. The collapse of order in real life and the prevailing values of fame and fortune awakened writers yearning for past eras, especially the Middle Ages. At the beginning of the 19th century, French novels were still relatively impoverished. After the French Revolution, the battlefield of Romanticism began in the theaters of Paris, and Hugo was one of its main figures. However, it wasn't until 1830, when his play Hernani successfully premiered, marking a fundamental victory of Romantic drama over pseudo-classicism, that he remembered he still had a novel contract and began to focus on writing The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. He completed the entire book in just 6 months, almost in one breath, and achieved an epic work that vividly portrayed the medieval ambience of Paris, presenting a panoramic view of the French people from kings to beggars. Before we dive into the main story, it's worth mentioning that Hugo wrote 2 prefaces, with the second one added along with 3 additional chapters in the 1832 edition. Let's start with the first preface, which was quite short and written in 1831. It mainly explains the inspiration behind the author's writing of the novel. According to Hugo, during one of his climbs up the bell tower of Notre-Dame Cathedral, he saw a Greek word carved on the wall, anank, which means fate or destiny. He felt deeply moved by the profound significance and tragic implications encapsulated in this word. However, Hugo reveals that both the person who carved the word and the word itself have disappeared, creating a sense of mystery. The bell tower still stands today, but finding that word is no longer possible. As for the true meaning of the word, Hugo keeps it suspenseful, and it is only explained in the second preface published in 1832. Let's leave that as a cliffhanger and focus on the story itself. Part 1. The story begins on January 6, 1482, in Paris, where a group of commoners gathers at the Palace of Justice to watch the celebration of the Feast of Fools, a festive play commemorating the Epiphany of Jesus. The Feast of Fools is an occasion when the Church arranges performances of religious stories from the Bible to entertain and educate the common people, allowing them to experience the omnipresence of God. The author of this particular play is a young poet named Gringoire. He hopes to improve his reputation through the success of the performance, and earn some money to fill his stomach. However, right from the beginning, the play is constantly interrupted by unexpected incidents. Coincidentally, it is also a traditional holiday known as Festival of Fools, and the impatient audience starts competing and making foolish faces on the opposite side of the stage. In the end, Quasimodo, the bell ringer of Notre-Dame Cathedral, wins the title of King of Fools due to his naturally grotesque appearance. According to the book, he is described as a jumble of fragments put back together, an assemblage of all the pieces of a broken giant. A group consisting of beggars, servants, thieves, and students carries Quasimodo to march towards the square by the riverbank. The remaining few spectators are captivated by a gypsy girl named Esmeralda. Disheartened, Gringo Eyre also ran to the riverbank square to escape the crowd and join the audience watching Esmeralda's performance. In stark contrast to Quasimodo's extreme ugliness, Esmeralda radiated exquisite beauty, almost like a supernatural being. Everyone was captivated by her dancing and the skilled performance of the little goat she led, except for two individuals, the Archdeacon Claude Frollo of Notre-Dame and a woman known as the sack-wearing woman hiding in the rat hole. They berated her, accusing her of practicing witchcraft. They interrupted Esmeralda's singing, leading to the displeasure of the onlooking crowd. Just then, the procession carrying Quasimodo arrived at the riverbank square. Surprisingly, the feared King of Fools was harshly reprimanded and taken away by the Archdeacon. After the dispersal of the crowd, Gringo Eyre followed Esmeralda, intending to find a place to sleep through her assistance. However, on their way, they encountered Archdeacon Frollo commanding Quasimodo to seize Esmeralda. At that moment, a captain of the king's archers named Phoebus de Chateaupers passed by and rescued her while apprehending Quasimodo. Taking advantage of the chaos, Archdeacon Frollo escaped, and Gringo Eyre was captured by beggars and taken to a place called the Court of Miracles, where Parisian ruffians, beggars, thieves, and swindlers gathered. The beggar king demanded to hang Gringo Eyre unless a woman agreed to marry him. Esmeralda stepped forward and declared her willingness to marry him, thus saving his life. Up to this point, 1/5 of the novel has passed, and all the main characters have made their appearance. However, apart from the physical descriptions of Quasimodo and Esmeralda, we still have limited knowledge about their backgrounds. Readers focused on the plot may become impatient, feeling that Hugo is meandering and digressing. However, upon closer examination, we will discover that within these 100-plus pages, Hugo dedicates a significant portion to depicting the daily lives of medieval Parisian commoners. He draws from numerous historical works and even introduces a real character like Gringo Eyre to guide us into the story. Although the historical placement of Gringo Eyre, who was actually only 7 years old in 1482, and the overlapping of the Feast of Epiphany and Fool's Day are deliberate anachronisms, they serve the narrative needs. Hugo uses his novel not just to write a historical fiction but to record events that took place between 1789 and 1830. Speaking of history, let's take a look at the situation in Paris when Hugo wrote this novel. In reality, the people of Paris were living in dire conditions at that time. The execution of the French king led to strained relations with other monarchies in Europe, as they turned against the new republic. Continuous conflicts between different factions further worsened the economic situation, and even basic sustenance became a challenge for the common people. In fact, according to descriptions by some historians, the streets of Paris in the early 19th century were filled with corpses and rotting flesh. If you stepped on the ground a little too hard, blood would seep out from underneath the paving stones. From Napoleon's rise to power to the invasion of Paris by the anti-French alliance in 1814, France was involved in 40 major and minor wars over a period of 14 years. It can be imagined that the impoverished residents of Paris at that time had to face various material shortages and the constant threat of violence. Prior to the July Revolution, with the rise of the bourgeoisie, the principle of money supremacy seemed to sever the possibilities of heroism and romantic imagination, instead descending into a repressed, mundane, and petty bourgeois existence. Thus, the depiction of Paris in 1482 by Hugo became a projection of the reality in 1830. A more observant reader might wonder why specifically 1482 and not any other period in the Middle Ages. The novel also mentions that this was the year before the death of Louis XI, the king whose reign saw significant territorial expansion, economic development, and the consolidation of monarchical absolutism. His reign strongly challenged the position of the Church and can be seen as witnessing the dawn of a flourishing era for the monarchy. However, just like the recently overthrown Bourbon dynasty in reality, his rule was also coming to an end. Part 2. Hugo suddenly shifts the narrative back 16 years to when the young Quasimodo was abandoned at the doorstep of Notre-Dame Cathedral. No one dared to approach this frightening-looking child except for the young priest, Frollo. He took Quasimodo with him and raised him within the cathedral. Although Frollo is not the first character that comes to mind when discussing this book, he is a character who embodies the spirit of Romanticism. He was sent to study theology at a young age and dedicated himself to his studies, having no practical understanding of life. At the age of 19, his parents died in a plague, leaving him with a younger brother, which forced him to face the realities of life for the first time. He adopted Quasimodo to accumulate merits for his brother. For the sake of his brother, Frollo made a lifelong commitment to celibacy, renouncing marriage and children, and devoting all his time to serving God and pursuing knowledge. However, he faced setbacks in both aspects. His brother became a troublemaker, and his pursuit of knowledge reached a dead end. Gradually, he was tormented by this unattainable situation and became a character similar to Faust, willing to resort to mystical and esoteric practices like alchemy in his quest for truth. He also despised women, not even allowing princesses to step foot inside the cathedral. By the time the story unfolds, Frollo's repressed emotions have reached a boiling point, and Esmeralda becomes the spark that ignites his desires. Esmeralda's beauty makes him realize that the truth he had been pursuing all along was hollow and meaningless. He feels that fate is mercilessly torturing him, deliberately placing an unattainable woman in front of him. And his desires and self-reflection are driving him almost insane. It is through him that we see a complete subversion of the perfect and resolute protagonists admired in classical literature, replaced by a struggling, sensitive, yet more genuine character. It is he who brings Quasimodo into the cathedral, giving the place a soul and infusing it with some vitality. After reviewing Quasimodo's background, the narrative time of the novel returns to 1482. Quasimodo is put on trial for his abduction of Esmeralda, but unfortunately, both he and the judge are deaf. After a trial that resembles a farce, Quasimodo is sentenced to receive flogging and be displayed on the pillory for 2 hours. Among the onlookers, a woman and her companion discuss an unfortunate incident that occurred 15 years ago in Reims. A musician's daughter, driven by circumstances, became a prostitute, and the daughter she cherished so much was exchanged by gypsies for a deformed child. In 1825, Hugo was invited to attend the coronation ceremony of Charles X, where he heard many bizarre legends, including several characters similar to Quasimodo. Later, in his memoirs, Hugo claimed that all the ancient Gallic fables were born here. Another theory suggests that Hugo saw a dancing gypsy girl on the streets of Reims, who became the prototype for Esmeralda in this book. Subsequently, we learn that the bag woman in the rat hole is the unfortunate woman in the story. Because of this, she harbors a deep hatred for the gypsies. Quasimodo was taken to the riverside square for the second time, where he was met with nothing but disgust and mockery. He asked the onlookers for water to drink, and only Esmeralda responded to his request. In the popular sentimental love novels of the time, their relationship would have developed into a love transcending the mundane, but of course, Hugo wouldn't write it that way. Captain Phoebus, who saved Esmeralda, has already firmly captured the gypsy girl's heart. This Captain Phoebus is a complete scoundrel, despite his noble birth, and only knows about drinking and seducing women. Upon learning of Esmeralda's affection for him, he immediately decides to seduce her. On the night of their date, Phoebus gets heavily drunk and encounters the vice-bishop Frollo disguised as a beggar. The vice-bishop accidentally overhears the conversation between Phoebus and his brother about the date, and follows Phoebus in a state of despair. He doesn't believe that Esmeralda would truly surrender herself to Phoebus, so to verify this, he even offers money to Phoebus for a room, with the condition that Phoebus must agree to let the vice-bishop hide nearby and secretly watch his and Esmeralda's date. Surprisingly, Phoebus agrees to this rather twisted request. The vice bishop hides in a small dark room next to the chamber, and watches as Esmeralda and Phoebus express their love. Just as Esmeralda is about to succumb to Phoebus's seduction, the vice bishop can no longer bear it, and jumps out, stabbing Phoebus. The story reaches its climax from here, with a mixture of terror and hope, and the plot unfolds in a way that keeps one's breath held. The court accuses Esmeralda of assassinating Phoebus, and she is tortured until she falsely confesses due to the belief in her alleged witchcraft. The vice bishop Frollo goes to the prison to find her, demanding that she choose between the gallows and himself, deceiving her by claiming that Phoebus is already dead. Esmeralda desperately refuses Frollo. Just as people are about to hang Esmeralda, she sees Phoebus sitting on the balcony of his fiancée's house, but this scoundrel has long forgotten about Esmeralda. Suddenly, Quasimodo appears and rescues Esmeralda, taking her to seek refuge in Notre-Dame Cathedral. Upon discovering that Esmeralda is still alive, Frollo falls deeper into a frenzy of self-doubt, and ultimately decides to yield to his desires. One night, he attempts to break into Esmeralda's room but is almost killed by Quasimodo, who guards the door. The vice bishop, filled with anger and shame, is determined to ensure that no one else can have her. However, he still can't bear to let go of Esmeralda. Upon learning that the king intends to have Esmeralda taken out of Notre-Dame Cathedral to be hanged, Frollo seeks the help of Gringoire and the band of beggars, hoping to use their power to rescue her. However, Quasimodo mistakenly believes they have come to capture, not save, Esmeralda, and he single-handedly resists the attacking crowd. Frollo's brother also gets caught up in the crowd and is thrown down from the cathedral by Quasimodo, falling to his death. Just as Quasimodo is about to be overwhelmed, Phoebus arrives on the king's orders to suppress the riot. Thinking he has once again saved Esmeralda, Quasimodo joyfully goes to her room to find her, only to discover it empty. As it turns out, during the intense conflict in front of the cathedral, Frollo and Gringoire secretly took Esmeralda and her little goat away. They boarded a small boat and left Notre Dame. Gringoire left with the goat. The vice bishop brought Esmeralda to the gallows at the Place de Grève, forcing her to choose between himself and death. Esmeralda once again refused Frollo, declaring that her love belonged only to Phoebus. Enraged and humiliated, Frollo handed her over to La Esmeralda, the bag woman. Astute readers had long suspected that the two were the mother and daughter who had been separated 16 years ago, but this belated reunion was soon destroyed by soldiers led by Phoebus. The mother died, and the daughter was sent to the gallows. Quasimodo, witnessing all of this through Frollo, who had been watching from the bell tower, down to his death. He shed tears and lamented the loss of the only two people he had ever loved. When people came to collect Frollo's corpse, they discovered that Quasimodo had disappeared from Notre Dame. 2 years later, in a cellar outside Paris, his embrace of Esmeralda's skeleton was discovered. As people tried to separate the remains, they both turned into ashes. Looking solely at the main storyline, the characters and plot of this novel do indeed hold a strong attraction for readers. Generation after generation, readers have experienced a profound impact from the stark contrasts of good and evil, beauty and ugliness depicted in the text. From a contemporary perspective, the characterizations in The Hunchback of Notre-Dame are extremely extreme, highly dramatic, and even somewhat crude. Whether it is Esmeralda's beauty and goodness, Quasimodo's ugliness and goodness, or the beauty and wickedness of Phoebus, or the twisted and distorted nature of good and evil in Frollo, all reach their extremes in the text. Coupled with Hugo's passionate, penetrating, and provocative writing style, this novel undeniably possesses an unforgettable charm. Part 3. However, The Hunchback of Notre-Dame contains much more in terms of scope and content. To discuss this matter, we need to start from the beginning. We know that the first edition of the novel achieved tremendous success, prompting a reprint in 1832. This time, in addition to the second preface by the author, Hugo included 3 new chapters. These 3 chapters were particularly important to Hugo, and one could even say they conveyed what he truly intended to express through this novel. So why weren't they included in the previous edition? Interestingly enough, It was due to a conflict with the publisher. Back in November 1828, Hugo had signed a contract with the publisher, agreeing to write a historical novel, which was popular in France at the time. Originally, he was supposed to submit the manuscript the following year. However, due to the Romantic literary movement mentioned earlier, Hugo became fully engrossed in writing plays, causing delays in the completion of this book. Eventually, the publisher grew impatient and set a deadline for him to submit the manuscript by the end of 1830, or else he would face a significant penalty for breach of contract. By July, Hugo was in desperate need of money, especially since his wife had just given birth to their fifth child. He had no choice but to sit down and write the novel. Just 2 days into writing, the July Revolution erupted. This would have been a valid reason for further delaying the manuscript, but surprisingly, Hugo remained committed and continued writing until October. As he became deeply engrossed in his writing, he realized that the original length was insufficient for his ideas to fully unfold. He approached the publisher and asked how much more money he could receive if he added another volume. The publisher had reached the limit of their patience and firmly rejected the proposal. It was only after Hugo switched to another publisher in 1832 that he finally included these 3 chapters back into the novel. 2 of these chapters are what we now see as the 3rd volume, titled The Cathedral and a Bird's Eye View of Paris. With passionate fervor, Hugo vividly depicts the entire structure and the panoramic view of Paris seen from the bell tower. He discusses the various details of Notre-Dame, passionately extolling its beauty and lamenting the destruction it has endured over the passing years and through revolutions. He also criticizes the alterations and additions made by architects of different schools to the cathedral, and the losses suffered by all Parisian architecture. He urges readers to imagine and reconstruct medieval Paris, where the ancient buildings, like Notre-Dame, shimmered with an epic radiance, yet were constantly torn down and rebuilt every 50 years in the city's ongoing development. Hugo even mournfully asserts, "The Paris of our descendants will be a Paris of plaster." We can easily imagine the situation at that time when, amid repeated revolutions by various factions, the urban areas of Paris were already in ruins. After Napoleon came to power, there was yet another wave of reconstruction to showcase his new regime. Furthermore, with the declining influence of the church, many churches were demolished. In order to construct new residential areas, numerous historical buildings were also torn down. Hugo strongly disapproved of this and was determined to protect the few remaining historical buildings in Paris. Between the 2 versions of the Hunchback of Notre-Dame, he even wrote an article titled "To the Destroyers, War." He spent 13 years working in a government organization dedicated to the preservation of monuments. Based on subsequent events and contemporary assessments, it is evident that the publication of The Hunchback of Notre-Dame played a decisive role in the restoration of the cathedral and the preservation of Parisian architecture. At that time, there were many buildings in Paris and throughout France facing forced demolitions or destruction. Why did Hugo choose Notre-Dame to tell such a story? This cathedral, built in the Middle Ages over a span of more than 300 years, is a groundbreaking masterpiece of Gothic architecture. It is the true center of Paris, its geographical point zero, where the administrative districts start and distances are measured from. Its connection to the monarchy is deeply intertwined. Since its construction, several kings have married, set off to war, and received baptisms within its walls. Even when Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, he chose this cathedral for his coronation ceremony. In the novel, King Louis XI, upon hearing about the attack on Notre-Dame by the poor, becomes furious, stating that they are besieging our mistress and are enemies of the French monarchy. Notre-Dame is a profoundly sacred presence. Therefore, once Esmeralda, a condemned prisoner, enters the cathedral, she receives protection, and ordinary people are not allowed to go in and seize her. After ordering her execution, the king kneels down to pray for forgiveness from the Virgin Mary, vowing not to repeat such an incident. The construction process of Notre-Dame also reflects the rapid development of 12th century Paris, witnessing how the city rose and became an economic, cultural, and administrative center under the rule of the monarchy. As described by Hugo in this chapter, this building carries numerous traces of history and has even become a living entity of sorts. Hugo's writing techniques seem to draw inspiration from this structure. Notre-Dame is a quintessential example of Gothic architecture, with a striking contrast between intricacy and simplicity, light and shadow. As time passes, the appearance of Notre-Dame constantly changes, absorbing characteristics of various architectural styles from different periods, yet its essence remains classical. It is akin to the contrast-based approach used extensively in portraying characters in the novel, blending elements of tragedy, historical drama, satirical comedy, poetry, and more within the narrative framework, while fundamentally pursuing beauty. In the third newly added chapter, Hugo, through the words of the Archdeacon Claude Frollo, expresses his thoughts on the line "Books will kill architecture." In his view, architecture is the language of stone. Before the advent of printing, stone structures were the written language of humanity, expressing all human thoughts. However, in the 15th century, the printing press emerged, which was a more radical change than the revolution itself. It altered the way humans expressed themselves and thought, leading to the decline of the art of architecture. In reality, before 1789, although publishing in France was prosperous, it was after the French Revolution that it truly became a mass medium. The number of bookstores, printing presses, and newspapers multiplied exponentially. Paperback books became popular in the market, and people began to develop a habit of reading novels. Therefore, Hugo also acknowledges that books are another form of architecture, where different styles and arts from different periods converge, creating a great testament of wisdom, much like Notre-Dame. You may recall the word destiny that Hugo mentioned in the preface. On the day of Esmeralda and Phoebus' meeting, the archdeacon, tormented by desire and on the verge of collapse, inscribed this word on the wall of Notre-Dame using a pair of compasses. Initially, we thought this word foreshadowed an irreversible tragic outcome to follow. However, after understanding the contents of these 3 chapters, we discover that it points to something more universal and grand, unrelated to justice or human emotions. To put it in more mystical terms, we can refer to it as the inevitable direction of historical development. This is also why Hugo's work transcends the boundaries of genre novels and is acclaimed as great. After the French Revolution, due to the downfall of the Bourbon dynasty and the decline of religious influence, many Romantic writers no longer believed that individual destinies were determined by God, royalty, and religious powers. Instead, they believed that individual destinies were shaped by nature and human actions. However, Hugo differed from them. In many of his poems, he extolled the concept of love and considered it to be the ultimate destiny of humanity. For him, love is both the beginning and the end of human life. In Hugo's writings, 1830s Paris is not just a city, it becomes a symbol of freedom and human nature. The Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris transcends time and all royal authority, and is connected to past glory, faith, and greatness. Hugo wrote extensively about the impoverished people of Paris, documenting the vibrant vitality of the civic society. It can even be said that he mythologized the people of Paris and the historical buildings represented by the Notre-Dame Cathedral, tightly linking their destinies together. When we understand all of this background, we realize that popular culture has largely simplified and misunderstood the Hunchback of Notre-Dame. The dramatic plot of the novel has become a source of inspiration for many artists and has been adapted into numerous films, animations, musicals, and more, achieving tremendous success. The character of Quasimodo, the bell ringer, has become a stereotyped figure. However, in these adaptations, especially Disney's animated version, there is an increasing tendency to focus on the beauty and the beast aspect of the story. Even the English title of the book was changed to The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, ignoring the true protagonist that Hugo wanted to convey, Notre-Dame. Among the readers who actually read this book, many may skim over the lengthy discourses and descriptions, thus simplifying Hugo into a writer focused on plot conflicts, underestimating the profound historical and aesthetic significance of this book. In summary, The Hunchback of Notre-Dame is not as simple as a historical novel. It embeds fictional characters and situations within historical figures and events, foreseeing the overall destiny of Paris and even France. Understanding this book not only provides insights into medieval and 19th century Paris but also enhances our understanding of the spirit of Paris as a modern city. Let's recap the key points of today's discussion. Firstly, Victor Hugo was a national writer of 19th century France and a prominent figure in the Romantic literary movement. The Hunchback of Notre-Dame is one of his most important works, vividly portraying the medieval atmosphere of Paris and reflecting the political reality of 19th century France in the form of a historical novel. Secondly, Hugo's true intention in writing this novel was to advocate for the protection of historical buildings in Paris. Thanks to his efforts, the Notre Dame Cathedral was later restored quite well, and the people of Paris began to pay attention to the issue of preserving historical architecture. Thirdly, in addition to its dramatic plot, the novel incorporates extensive discussions on aesthetics and philosophy. Within the framework of a tragic narrative, Hugo adds elements of historical drama, satirical comedy, poetry, and more. He also explores the significance of printing replacing architecture as a means of transmitting human thought. Lastly, in Hugo's portrayal, 1830s Paris becomes more than just a city, it becomes a symbol of freedom and human nature. He documents the vibrant vitality of civic society, mythologizes the people and architecture of Paris, and tightly links their destinies together within the novel. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.